The night before everything changed, I stood in my bedroom staring at a plain white envelope resting on my desk. Inside was a simple invitation that had somehow become the most intimidating piece of paper I'd ever held. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a dare. It was simply an opportunity to experience something completely outside my comfort zone, a professional makeover designed to encourage people to explore confidence through fashion, styling, and self-expression. I must have picked that envelope up 20 times before finally slipping it into my jacket pocket. I still wasn't sure if I would actually go. The next morning, I almost turned the car around 3 different times. Every traffic light felt like another chance to escape. My mind raced with every possible worst-case scenario. What if I looked ridiculous? What if everyone else already knew what they were doing? What if someone recognized me? Those questions repeated themselves so often that they almost convinced me to drive home. Instead, I parked. The studio looked surprisingly ordinary from the outside. No flashing lights. No cameras. No audience. Just a quiet building with large windows and a small sign welcoming participants. As soon as I stepped inside, the nervous energy that had been building for days became impossible to hide. A smiling coordinator walked over and handed me a name badge. "You made it." 3 simple words. Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Why are you here?" Just, "You made it." For some reason, that immediately relaxed me. The waiting area was filled with people from completely different backgrounds. Some looked confident. Others were clearly just as nervous as I was. A few quietly laughed with each other while sipping coffee. One man admitted it had taken him 2 months to decide whether to attend. Another confessed he'd nearly canceled that morning. Hearing that made me realize I wasn't the only person stepping into unfamiliar territory. The coordinator explained that today's experience wasn't about pretending to become someone else. It was about seeing yourself from a different perspective and learning how clothing, posture, grooming, and confidence could completely change the way you carried yourself. That sentence stayed with me. Maybe this wasn't about changing who I was. Maybe it was about discovering confidence I never realized existed. One by one, participants were called into private styling rooms. Eventually, my name echoed through the hallway. I swallowed hard. This is it. Inside the room, everything felt calm. Bright mirrors surrounded the space, but instead of making me uncomfortable, they reflected soft lighting that made the room feel welcoming. Racks of carefully organized clothing lined one wall. Shoes were displayed neatly below them. Tables held makeup brushes, palettes, skincare products, and neatly folded accessories. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt overwhelming. A stylist introduced herself with a warm smile. "Today isn't about perfection," she said. "It's about discovering possibilities." She didn't ask me what size dress I wanted. She didn't immediately start choosing outfits. Instead, she sat across from me and asked questions. "What colors do you naturally like? What kind of clothes make you feel comfortable? When do you feel most confident?" Nobody had ever asked me those questions before. I answered honestly. "I've never really thought about it." She smiled. "Most people haven't." She explained that confidence often starts long before clothes ever enter the conversation. Good posture, skincare, grooming habits, and paying attention to details create the foundation. Clothing simply builds on that foundation. She handed me a small mirror. "Before we change anything, look carefully." I stared at my reflection. Tired eyes, messy hair, shoulders slightly hunched. Nothing looked terrible, but nothing looked intentional either. "Now imagine," she continued, "that every decision you make today is simply about presenting the best version of yourself." That idea suddenly made everything feel much less intimidating. The makeover didn't begin with makeup. It started with skincare. She explained every step carefully. Clean skin helps everything else look natural. Hydration creates a smoother appearance. Taking care of yourself isn't masculine or feminine. It's simply self-care. For the first time, I realized how little attention I'd ever paid to my own routine. Next came grooming. She carefully shaped my eyebrows without dramatically changing them. "It's amazing," she smiled, "how tiny details change the entire face." She wasn't wrong. Even before any makeup appeared, My reflection already looked more awake. Then came foundation. I expected it to feel heavy. Instead, it was incredibly light. She showed me how tiny amounts blended naturally rather than hiding everything underneath. This isn't about wearing a mask, she explained. It's about creating balance. As she worked, she encouraged me to ask questions. Why choose one shade instead of another? Why apply concealer only in certain places? Why blend instead of covering? Every answer made perfect sense. There was technique behind everything. Nothing was random. Next came subtle contouring. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create soft definition. I watched the transformation happen slowly instead of all at once, and somehow that made it easier to accept. The person in the mirror still looked like me, just more polished. My heartbeat slowed. The fear that had followed me all morning gradually disappeared. Then she picked up a neutral eyeshadow palette. We're keeping everything natural. Layer by layer, soft colors added depth without looking obvious. Mascara followed. Then a gentle lip color. Nothing bright, nothing exaggerated. Just enough to complete the overall appearance. She finally stepped back. We're halfway there. Halfway? I could hardly believe how much had already changed. She reached toward a nearby mannequin and lifted a beautifully styled shoulder-length wig. This usually changes everything. As she carefully adjusted it, tiny strands framed my face naturally. She trimmed a few pieces around the front before turning my chair toward the mirror. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The face looking back at me wasn't someone pretending. It wasn't someone hiding. It was still recognizably me, yet somehow softer, calmer, more confident. Without thinking, I leaned closer to the mirror. My eyes searched every detail. The eyebrows, the hairstyle, the smile beginning to appear. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I smiled. A genuine smile. One that appeared without effort. The stylist noticed immediately. There it is. What? The confidence. I looked back at the mirror once more. For the first time that day, I wasn't wondering what everyone else would think. I was wondering something completely different. What would happen when the outfit completed the transformation? The stylist disappeared into the wardrobe area and returned with several carefully selected outfits hanging neatly on wooden hangers. She didn't immediately hand me a dress. Instead, she laid everything across a table and explained why each piece had been chosen. Clothing isn't just about appearance, she said. It's about proportion, comfort, confidence, and how you carry yourself. That surprised me. I had expected someone to simply tell me what to wear. Instead, every decision had a purpose. She showed me how different fabrics draped differently depending on posture. Softer materials created flowing movement, while structured fabrics helped shape the silhouette. Certain colors reflected light onto the face, making skin appear brighter. Others could make someone look tired, without them even realizing why. I had never paid attention to details like that before. She held up two nearly identical blouses. Which one would you choose? They look the same. She smiled. They never do once they're worn. A few moments later, she proved her point. The first blouse felt slightly stiff around the shoulders. The second moved naturally with every step. They're almost identical, I admitted. Almost, she replied. Almost is what separates feeling dressed from feeling comfortable. That sentence stayed with me. She selected a soft cream blouse with delicate sleeves, a navy knee-length skirt, sheer tights, and a pair of modest heels that looked elegant without being intimidating. I promise, she laughed, noticing my expression, these aren't as difficult as they look. Changing clothes felt strangely emotional. As each piece replaced the casual clothes I'd arrived in, I became increasingly aware of my posture. The skirt naturally encouraged shorter steps. The blouse made me stand straighter. The fitted waist subtly changed how I balanced my shoulders. Everything felt unfamiliar, but it didn't feel wrong. When I stepped out of the changing area, the stylist didn't immediately look at the outfit. Instead, she watched how I walked. Stop. I froze. You're still walking exactly like you were wearing trainers. I laughed nervously. I don't know any other way. That's completely normal. She demonstrated first. Small steps. Relax shoulders. Gentle arm movement. Looking forward instead of down. No rush. No giant strides. Let the clothes move naturally. It sounded simple. Doing it was another story. My first few attempts felt awkward enough to make everyone laugh. Except, nobody laughed. The other stylists offered encouragement instead. Better. Relax your shoulders. Excellent improvement. You'll get it. Every correction was practical rather than critical. Within 15 minutes, something remarkable happened. Walking no longer required constant concentration. My body slowly adapted. The heels that had seemed impossible 10 minutes earlier suddenly felt manageable. I still wasn't graceful, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The stylist then handed me a small handbag. I instinctively grabbed it with a clenched fist. She gently shook her head. Hold it naturally. Tiny adjustment. Completely different appearance. She demonstrated how simple hand positioning could change the overall presentation. Relaxed fingers. Gentle movements. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing theatrical. Just natural elegance. Next came sitting down. Another lesson I had never imagined mattered. She explained how posture influences confidence as much as appearance. Rather than collapsing into the chair, she demonstrated sitting smoothly while keeping the outfit comfortable and neat. Again, it wasn't about pretending. It was about awareness. Every small detail gradually built confidence. Then she brought me toward a full-length mirror. Don't analyze. Observe. That wording made all the difference. Instead of searching for flaws, I simply looked. The transformation no longer felt like a costume. It felt like the result of dozens of small, thoughtful decisions. Healthy skin. Well-groomed eyebrows. Natural makeup. Balanced colors. Proper fit. Good posture. Relaxed expression. Nothing alone created the transformation. Everything together did. The stylist handed me a notebook. Inside were pages filled with styling tips. How to identify clothing that fits correctly. How different necklines affect facial appearance. Basic skincare routines. Simple makeup techniques. Walking practice. Color combinations. Accessory balance. I smiled. This is more educational than I expected. She laughed. Confidence can be learned. Those 4 words echoed through my mind. Confidence can be learned. Not bought. Not borrowed. Learned. Later that afternoon, all the participants gathered in a comfortable lounge area where everyone shared their experiences. One participant admitted he'd spent years believing appearance didn't matter. Another confessed he had always avoided photographs because he disliked how he looked. Someone else explained that learning proper grooming had completely changed the way he approached job interviews. Everyone had arrived for different reasons. Yet every story carried the same lesson. Confidence rarely appears overnight. It grows through practice. Listening to everyone speak made me realize something unexpected. Nobody was trying to become someone else. Everyone was simply discovering a version of themselves they had never explored before. As the afternoon continued, the coordinator announced one final activity. Each participant would walk alone into the portrait studio for a professional photograph. Immediately, my nerves returned. Pictures last forever. Unlike mirrors, photographs capture moments you can't instantly erase. I quietly considered skipping it. The stylist noticed. Nervous? A little. She smiled knowingly. Good. I looked confused. Why good? Because it means today mattered. That answer stopped me completely. She adjusted a loose strand of hair near my cheek, straightened the sleeve of my blouse, and stepped back. You've spent hours learning today. Don't hide from the result. When my name was called, I walked toward the studio with my heart racing again. Bright lights illuminated a simple white backdrop. A photographer greeted me warmly. No pressure. We'll take our time. I stood in the center of the room. My hands felt awkward. My smile disappeared. The photographer noticed instantly. Forget the camera. Think about how you felt the moment you first smiled in the mirror. I closed my eyes for a second. I remembered that moment. The surprise. The disbelief. The growing confidence. Then I opened my eyes. The photographer smiled. There it is. Click. The camera captured the first image, then another, and another. With each photograph, I relaxed a little more. I stopped wondering how I looked. I started enjoying the experience. By the end of the session, I had almost forgotten I was standing under studio lights. The photographer lowered the camera. "I think there's one picture you're going to remember for a very long time." I smiled politely, unsure whether he was simply being encouraging or genuinely believed it. A few minutes later, everyone gathered around a large display screen where the edited portraits would be revealed one by one. As each image appeared, applause filled the room. People who had walked in looking uncertain now radiated confidence. Some laughed. Some became emotional. A few quietly wiped away tears. Finally, my photograph appeared on the screen. The room fell silent for just a moment. I looked up, and for the second time that day, I barely recognized the person looking back at me. But this time, the feeling was completely different. I wasn't shocked by the makeup. I wasn't focused on the clothes. I wasn't even looking at the hairstyle. I was looking at the expression. For the first time in years, I looked genuinely confident. And that single photograph would lead to an unexpected conversation that would change far more than just the way I saw my reflection. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. It wasn't because of the makeup, the hairstyle, or the outfit. Those were only part of the picture. What stayed with me was the expression. The person smiling back at the camera looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. There was no forced grin, no nervous tension around the eyes, no awkward posture. It looked like someone who had finally stopped worrying about what everyone else thought. On the drive home, I kept replaying the day in my mind. Every lesson, every conversation, every small correction the stylist had made suddenly seemed connected. None of it had been about changing my identity. It had been about learning how confidence is built through attention to detail, patience, and self-care. When I arrived home, I placed the printed photograph on my desk. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. It almost felt impossible that only a few hours earlier I had been standing in front of the studio doors wondering whether to leave before anyone saw me. Now I was wondering something completely different. Could I actually learn these skills on my own? The next morning, instead of putting the photograph away in a drawer, I left it where I could see it every day. Not because I wanted to copy that exact appearance, but because it reminded me of how confidence had felt. That weekend, I visited a bookstore and bought 3 beginner guides covering skincare, color coordination, grooming, and personal style. I spent hours reading topics I had ignored for most of my life. I learned why moisturizer matters, why different face shapes suit different hairstyles, how color temperature changes the way clothing looks against skin, why posture affects first impressions before someone even speaks. It fascinated me. Every answer led to another question. Soon learning became a hobby. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of a clothing store. Normally, I would have walked straight past. Instead, I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The assistant greeted me politely without making any assumptions. "Can I help you with anything today?" I'm still learning about fashion." She smiled warmly. "Then you've come to the right place." There was no judgment, only professionalism. She explained how fabrics feel different throughout the day, why proper measurements matter more than clothing size, and how neutral colors can be mixed easily while building a wardrobe. Rather than encouraging me to buy lots of expensive items, she suggested beginning with versatile basics that could be combined in different ways. That advice made perfect sense. I left with only a few carefully chosen pieces. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just clothing selected thoughtfully. Back at home, I practiced everything the stylist had taught me. Walking, standing, turning naturally, relaxing my shoulders, smiling without forcing it. At first, I still felt self-conscious. Sometimes I laughed at myself. Sometimes I made mistakes. But each practice session became easier than the last. Weeks passed. Little by little, unfamiliar movements became natural habits. One evening, while organizing old photographs, I found pictures taken just a year earlier. The difference surprised me. It wasn't only my appearance, it was my posture. In every old picture, my shoulders leaned forward. My expression looked tired. My eyes rarely looked directly at the camera. The newer photograph told a completely different story. I looked comfortable. That realization changed something inside me. Confidence isn't something that suddenly appears one morning. It's something you quietly build through dozens of small improvements that eventually become part of who you are. Several months later, the same studio invited previous participants back for a reunion workshop. This time, I didn't hesitate. Walking through those familiar doors felt completely different from the first visit. Instead of anxiety, I felt excitement. The coordinator recognized me immediately. "You look different." I laughed. "I know." "No," she replied with a smile. "I don't mean your clothes. You carry yourself differently." That compliment meant more than she probably realized. During the workshop, the stylists asked former participants to share what they had learned since attending. One person had completely transformed his grooming routine. Another had become interested in fashion design. Someone else said they finally felt comfortable smiling in family photographs. When my turn came, I paused for a moment. I thought I came here to learn about appearance. Everyone listened quietly, but I actually learned about confidence. The room became silent. I spent years believing confidence was something people were born with. It isn't. It's built. It's practiced. It's earned through patience. Several people nodded. The stylist who had worked with me on my first visit smiled proudly. "I knew you'd figure that out." After the discussion, she invited me back into the same styling room where my journey had begun. Everything looked almost identical. The mirrors, the lights, the wardrobe, the makeup station. Only one thing had changed. Me. She handed me a brush. "This time, you show me." I blinked in surprise. "What?" "You've been practicing. I can tell." "Let's see what you've learned." For the next hour, I completed much of the routine myself. Preparing the skin, applying light foundation, blending carefully, choosing subtle colors, adjusting the hairstyle. Everything took longer than it had for the professionals. But I understood why every step mattered. When I finally finished, she barely made any corrections. She simply smiled. "You've developed your own style." Those words meant more than any compliment about appearance ever could. Later that afternoon, she asked me to stand once again in front of the full-length mirror. I looked carefully. The reflection was elegant, natural, comfortable, but the biggest difference wasn't visible in the clothing or makeup. It was visible in my eyes. There was no uncertainty anymore. No hesitation. Just quiet confidence. The stylist stepped beside me and folded her arms. "Tell me honestly, what do you see?" Months earlier, I would have described every physical detail. The hairstyle, the outfit, the makeup. This time, I smiled before answering. "I see someone who stopped being afraid of trying something new." She nodded slowly. "Exactly." As I continued looking into the mirror, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me during the entire journey. The title of my story had never really been about appearance. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It wasn't about pretending. It wasn't even about the makeover itself. It was about perspective. Months ago, I looked into a mirror searching for reasons to doubt myself. Now I looked into the same mirror searching for reasons to keep growing. The reflection hadn't simply changed because of clothes. It had changed because my confidence had. And as I smiled at the person looking back at me, one quiet thought crossed my mind. A new woman hadn't replaced the old me. A more confident version of myself had simply been waiting for me to look closely enough to finally see it. A few weeks after the reunion workshop, something unexpected happened. The studio contacted me with a simple request. "We're holding another confidence and styling event for first-time participants," the coordinator said over the phone. "Would you be willing to come back? Not as a participant this time, but as someone who can share your experience?" I was speechless. The thought of standing in front of strangers and talking about my journey would have terrified the person I used to be. Now I found myself saying yes before I had time to overthink it. On the morning of the event, I arrived early. I watched new participants walk through the same entrance I had once entered with shaking hands. I recognized the nervous smiles, the hesitant steps, the constant glances towards the exit. One gentleman sat quietly in the corner, gripping his coffee cup so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. I walked over and introduced myself. "First time?" He nodded. "I'm thinking about leaving." I smiled because I remembered saying almost the exact same thing. "I nearly left too." He looked surprised. "You?" I was standing outside in the car for almost 20 minutes. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "I thought everyone else would be confident." "Trust me," I replied. "Most people are simply better at hiding their nerves." We talked for nearly half an hour before the workshop officially began. By the time his name was called, he smiled for the first time that morning. Watching him walk into the styling room reminded me of my own first steps. The coordinator later invited me to speak to the group. I stood in front of everyone, took a slow breath, and looked around the room. "I won't tell you that today will magically change your life." Several people looked curious. "I won't tell you that you'll leave looking completely different." A few smiled. "But I will tell you something I wish someone had told me before my first visit." The room became completely quiet. Don't spend today trying to impress anyone else. Spend today learning something about yourself. If you keep comparing yourself to other people, you'll miss the progress you're making. Confidence isn't created in one afternoon. It's built one small habit at a time. I noticed several participants nodding. The mirror doesn't create confidence. It simply reflects the confidence you've been building all along. When I finished speaking, the room filled with applause. Not loud, dramatic applause. Warm, genuine applause. After the workshop ended, participants gradually returned from their individual styling sessions. One by one they walked towards the large mirrors in the reception area. Some laughed. Some became emotional. One participant quietly whispered, "I never knew I could look this confident." Another said, "I wish I'd stopped doubting myself years ago." Listening to their reactions made me realize something important. Every journey was unique. No two people experienced the day in exactly the same way. Yet every transformation shared one common thread. The biggest change wasn't visible in the clothes. It happened in the way people stood, the way they smiled, the way they looked themselves in the eye. Before leaving, the lead stylist handed me a small envelope. "I think you've earned this." Inside was the very first photograph taken during my original makeover, alongside one taken earlier that afternoon. The two pictures sat side by side. The outfits were different. The hairstyle was different. The makeup techniques had improved. But the biggest difference wasn't fashion. It was confidence. The first photograph showed someone asking, "Do I belong here?" The second showed someone who already knew the answer. I slipped both photographs back into the envelope and thanked the entire team. As I walked towards the exit, I paused in front of the same full-length mirror that had greeted me on my first day. Months earlier, I had stared into that mirror searching for flaws. Now I looked into it with appreciation. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had learned that perfection was never the goal. Growth was. Confidence was. Self-respect was. The reflection smiling back at me wasn't defined by a hairstyle, an outfit, or makeup. It was defined by the willingness to step beyond fear and keep learning. As I opened the studio door, the coordinator called out one final question. "If you could go back and give one sentence of advice to the person who walked in here for the first time, what would you say?" I smiled without even needing to think. I'd tell them to stop being afraid of the mirror. Because sometimes the reflection isn't showing you who you are today. It's showing you who you're capable of becoming. I walked outside into the afternoon sunlight feeling lighter than I had in years. The journey had never really been about changing into someone else. It had been about discovering confidence through patience, practice, and self-expression. That first nervous step through the studio doors had become one of the most valuable decisions I had ever made. And every time I looked into a mirror after that day, I no longer searched for imperfections. Instead, I looked for progress. Because confidence doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly, one lesson at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And on the day I finally stopped seeing only my doubts, I realized the truth behind the journey. A new woman looked back at me, but more importantly, a more confident, kinder, and braver version of myself looked back as well. That reflection wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of everything that came next.